Willingness to pay. I've been thinking quite a lot about one of the central tenets of today's pricing. And one of the core elements of today's pricing theory is a customer's willingness to pay. And that is derived by how much someone is willing to partake with money or part with their money to buy a certain thing, to buy a certain service. So it sounds kind of obvious. Of course, someone has to have a willingness to pay, otherwise, they wouldn't have the product. But sometimes we've spent too much time on willingness to pay in the early part of the analysis. And this is maybe upsetting some of the AI progress currently. So if you think about AI is possibly the most, is that fair? Yeah, the most, if not the best, experimental, rapid development tool we've ever had. You've got an idea, you can quickly spin it up, either vibe code or simply using just Claude itself, and it will come up with something reasonable. But what people have mistaken is that reasonable output versus real output. Real output is something you're going to put into production and you're going to just sleep easy at night and Bob's your uncle. Reasonable output is something that shows you a really, really good concept of what you could develop if you put more money behind it. Almost like a sample for a record, as it were, before you make the full track, or a few beats if you're a DJ, before you say, okay, who's going to rap over this? And that then brings the willingness to pay to almost like an ability and a willingness to experiment. And so rather than saying, I'm going to introduce AI in the enterprise and it's going to basically convert, I don't know, Java 14 to 15 or 13 to 15, we can say it's actually going to be used to run experiments of a certain database from 13 to 15, for example, or of a certain new product or a certain new service. And we're going to do that mostly in UAT, ideally. And I think that gap in understanding that it's not meant to be immediately put into production and you have to have an R&D mindset is kind of what goes wrong. Not having an R&D mindset is why most firms, I believe, are struggling with the cost of AI. Because if you bring in AI and you say it's going to do all of these things, none of which are individual projects per se, but are just incremental work that you're going to have someone take on to reduce, obviously, work at the back end, you're not going to get the same results. So if we use the scenario of you want to do a change to, let's just say, credit ingestion and valuation in a bank. Now, you could have 10 people doing a project about that with the whole waterfall effect, or you could have 10 individual people not working together or vibe coding with a certain amount of credits, let's just say 10 grand each, and they basically being tasked to come up with a solution which probably only the top one or two will get picked, and then real money will be put behind that. So you're willing to spend the 10 times 10,000 tokens to get a really good concept of something that you're going to put money behind, which now, as you say, initial base cost is 100. You may put another 1 million behind it to say, let's refactor this with real humans or better AI and go from there. And so that's the willingness to experiment. And I've not heard much about, outside of the vibe coding, outside of founders, outside of people on LinkedIn, of enterprises actually saying we are having this technology come in because we've got willingness to experiment. A lot bigger willingness to experiment than we ever had before, a lot faster and a lot more aggressive, and a lot more interesting. And that difference then basically brings us to almost a model very similar to Google. Most people had no clue of how to sell a toilet or import, I suppose, dropship and then do PPC or some other Google ads or Facebook ads or Meta ads to basically get this product sold. So they would have to learn, and they would generally run a number of experiments, sometimes as many as 10. And that could be done by their agencies or they would do it themselves in-house. But they were running experiments, and they were running experiments to say, I don't know which is going to be the best user click or which one's going to get the best click-through rate or the best sales rate. But you know what? I'm going to try 10 or 12 different campaigns. And so in marketing, a much, much maligned part of the C-suite, they are doing a rock and roll job of, in the most part, experimental. But they look expensive because those experiments obviously cost money. But those experiments are keeping the inertia of the company going. And this is not me trying to shill marketing or CMOs, but you can see with the average tenure about, is it 18 months, 19 months, 20 months, the average tenure is very low because the job is a wicked, wicked job where you get a rough feedback very, very quickly. And then obviously the environment's constantly changing with this basically changing code at Google or this block at Meta, etc. So all in all, it basically says that pricing has to follow the business model that someone's operating. If they're operating in a experimental way, then actually the prices can be quite high because that experiment is no different from a startup experiment. You're almost doing lean coding. I know it's called vibe coding, but you're doing a lean production of a certain product or service, which you will put money behind if it proves successful in the trials, you could say. So what am I trying to say? All in all, the number one thing that people talk about is a willingness of the customer to pay. But I believe AI flips that on its head and says the number one thing the customer has to talk about, or we have to talk about with the customer, is what is their willingness to experiment and how much are those experiments worth to that particular client. And you'll find that that's normally a much, much, much bigger number than just a straightforward willingness to pay, because they don't probably know their propensity to advertise or propensity to create new things during AI. They have to find that out by doing, let's say, the advertising PPC. And then once they find that out, they then have to say, what does this actually mean to me? Is this relevant for me? Do I really have an experimental mindset? Do I have a willingness to experiment, a willingness to keep on trying until it works? If you don't have that mentality, it's very unlikely you're going to appreciate all the value that AI can bring because the business model is wrong. A broad brush incrementalism versus kind of a power law return outlook. That's kind of the main difference. So I'm Gary, a recovering investment banking chartered accountant with, I'll just say, a bit of a liking for pricing and monetization. And that's the pod for today. Bye-bye.
The pricing committee, velvet rope cartel, turning every checkout into Dante's seventh hell. Can we simplify? Gets treated like a crime, cause complexity looks smart when you present it in a slide. Every metric looking healthy till the profit disappear, like magic trick performed by venture capitalists of the year. Net retention floating high like a helium parade till the AWS invoice enters with a switchblade.